Um, Basic guidelines for you guys and gals. The first thing I want you to do is remember that this is not supposed to be a summary. This is not a book report. This is not where you're telling what's in the book. This is a book review. Book review means that you are analyzing the material. You're not just regurgitating it. So, what you're doing is you are reading the book or listening to the podcasts and then analyzing them to see whether these individuals did a good job of giving you the story according to the facts. All right, so with this book review, I'll start off with talking about the book review. Then, after I do talk about the book review, I'll talk about what you need to do for if you want to do the podcast instead. But if you do want to do a book review, what you need to do is pick a scholarly work. All right. A scholarly work is a historical work. This is not a memoir. It should not be a diary. It should not be a novel. It should not be literature. What it should be is a history book. All right. This is easy to tell. One of the first ways to tell is when you look at it, is it fact or fiction? That's one of the best and easiest ways to tell if the book you're looking at is something you need to use. Of course, if it's fiction or based on a true story, you don't want it. You want real history. So you want a book that is based on fact. Also, does this book have citations? What I mean by citations is, does it use primary and secondary sources? Does it use sources? All right. There'll be citations in the book saying where they got their information from. All right. Also, a very important way to tell is if it is based on primary documentation. All right. A history book should be like, say, you're going to read like one of these back here, one of my favorites that I push for you guys to use if you want a good book is John Adams by David McCullough. In this book, he uses primary sources. In other words, he uses newspapers, letters, memoirs, diaries, documents. He uses things from the time frame. So, what he's using to write this book about one of our founding fathers, John Adams, are the sources that surrounded Adams, right? So, primary sources. So, if you are looking for a history book, you want to make sure that it is made of primary sources. Also, you want to make sure that it is written by a trained historian. You'll notice that you'll see a lot of journalists and historians writing history books, and they are trained to do this. They have the education and the background to do this. And when you look into this and you think you find a book, you think it has primary sources, it looks like a decent one. You really should check out the author, right? You need to check out the author's background. Um, Battle Cry Freedom. It's a really good book about the Civil War. It's by James McPherson. McPherson is a PhD historian that teaches in the Ivy League schools. It's a very good one. One that wouldn't be good would be something like Killing Lincoln, or just one of these things that's put out by hack journalists. Because sometimes, like Bill O'Reilly, Sean Hannity, those kind of guys put out books they say are history books, but they're not really based on solid evidence. It's more propaganda than it is real history. So you want to research because some historians are better than others, some journalists are better than others. So the books you want are the ones that are based on primary documentation that is not put together for a political agenda. It is put there history for history's sake, right? So when you're doing this, an easy way to kind of get an idea of a good history book or a good author would be just to do a quick Google internet search. Check them out, see if that looks sound. If you do want to do a book review and you pick a book, you can always ask me if it's a good book, and I can tell you one way or the other. So, a little bit of start to it. Also, kind of the basic information for the paper. I want it to be MLA format. When you cite anything, use what's called Turabians or Chicago style. If you quote something, or you have a source, anytime you quote, you need to cite it. All right. The paper needs to be, like I said, 7 to 9 pages. You of course need to put your name, the class, and the date that is due on the paper. You can have a title if you want to call it that, but if I were you, for the title of the paper, use the title of the book. Also, like I said, it needs to be 12-point font, Times New Roman, and double spaced. All right. To get going, in that title, like I said, you need the title of the book. So for the title of your paper, I would just use the title of the book. And with this, what you need to put on there is the full title. All right. Which means the title and the subtitle. Like a lot of history books will have the main, like the big title and a little subtitle underneath that gives a longer explanation. Like, for example, Hemingway's Boat by Paul Hendrickson. Hemingway's Boat is the title, but the subtitle is Everything He Loved in Life and Lost, and it gives the date. So what you need to do when you're giving the book information, I would put it in the title of your paper, give the full title, the author's name, the name of the publisher, the date of publication, and then the ISBN. All right? So you need the full title, the author's name, the publisher, copyright date, and the ISBN. That is the book information. So once you put that in the title, you got that as the title, you've got your name, the class, and the date on there. Then you can start the paper itself. Of course, the first thing you need in a paper is your introduction. So your introductory paragraph needs to cover certain things. All right. The first paragraph should state the author's topic and thesis. So in other words, it's supposed to tell you what the book is about and what the author is trying to do with this book. All right. So, like I said, the first paragraph in this paper of yours, what you want to do is give the author's topic, basically an overview of the author's work and what the author's argument is, what their thesis is. All right. So, a topic. In other words, that is the subject of the book. That is the big picture. That is the whole story. So just a quick summary of what the book is about. And then the thesis, the author's thesis, their argument. This is a statement or a theory that is put forward as a premise, all right, to be maintained or proved. So if you look in the book and you want to know what the historian or journalist, what the history book's thesis and topic is, look at the intro. Look at the introduction of the book, and within the first 2 paragraphs, they'll tell you what the book's going to cover and what their thesis is. All right. So with your introduction, what you need to do is give your version, your summary, paraphrasing of what the book's about, and then state what the author's thesis is. All right. So, your title page, your intro paragraph, then the body, all right? Then the body of this paper should be just pieces of evidence. As you read this book, you'll see pieces of evidence that you think are really good, that leads to you actually believing the author's argument, the historian's argument, what they're trying to push, what they're trying to promote. And sometimes you'll read these pieces of evidence that you don't think hold their weight, right? They don't do a good job. So, what I want you to do in the body, I want you to basically pick, all right, roughly three or four things, three or four pieces of evidence that support the author's argument. And then three or four pieces of evidence where you don't think the author's evidence does support their argument. So what I want you to do is dig into it as you're reading it. Fine. It's like, well, here, here, and here, they did a great job. This evidence, these pieces of evidence do a great job of furthering the idea of, what the author's thesis is. And then there's these pieces of evidence that don't do that good of a job. So that is going to be the body of your paper. So this is the body of the paper is you basically describing and analyzing the author's evidence, the historian's evidence. All right. Also, in this body, usually it's easiest just to do it as the second paragraph right after the intro. I want you to describe the author's background. Okay. So say where they went to school, where they went to college, where they grew up, kind of give an overview of, kind of a background to the author. Get as much info on the author as you can, because that plays a big role. Where you grew up, where you go to school, all of these things play a role in shaping how historians write history. All right. So, first paragraph is your introduction. Then in the second paragraph, you give a little author background. All right. So, as you're doing all this, you're analyzing, you're giving a description of the evidence that does a good job of supporting the thesis, and you give evidence that does a poor job of supporting the thesis. And with this, basically what you're doing is analyzing and assessing the author's argument. All right. Then finally, in the conclusion. In the conclusion, all you're doing is summarizing. You summarize whether you think the author did their job and wrote a good history book based on the evidence, right? The pieces that are good, the pieces that are bad, and a lot of books. And every single history book has good and bad evidence. So you're going to be able to find a little of both, all right? So in this conclusion, what you're going to do is summarize what you think of the author's argument. And at this point, after you give a summary of your analysis, then you can give your opinion, what you thought of the book, how you felt about the book, whether you think other people should read it, that kind of thing. So that's the only part, at the very end, in the conclusion, after you've done everything else, you can give your personal opinion about the book. All right. But remember, this is an analysis. This is not a summary. So a book review is analysis. All right. So there's also another choice. You don't have to do a book review. I mean, you can, it's an option, but the other option is a podcast. All right. I have picked 3 different podcasts this time. We'll see how they work. But this podcast review, if you'd rather listen to it, you can. Listen to these other people tell historical stories rather than read, right? With the podcast, the best thing to do is, your devices that you use all the time, whether it's on your computer, your tablet, your phone, I've got the iPhone. I have the little podcast thing that comes right there on the phone where you get all your podcast. So, you know, if you've never used it, you know, look on the phone, it's there on your iPhone. If it's not on there and you got rid of it, or it was not on there, you can just go to the App Store and get it. Um, this is going to be the same format. It's going to be, MLA format, 12-point font, Times New Roman, 7 to 9 pages long. You're using MLA to write it. You're using that Turabian/Chicago style to cite if you quote anything. Um, so, a little quick overview. Um, you have, like I told you, you have 3 different podcasts to choose from. The first one is American Elections, Wicked Games. The first 20 episodes of it, they're about like 30 minutes each. Wicked Games, American Elections, is about the presidential elections from the first, all the way. What I'm using is basically from the first one up through our class. I'm using our class's time frame. So those 20 episodes you'll listen to. All right. So you can learn about presidential elections, or you could do the podcast 1865, which is a really good podcast about the year 1865. And you could just listen to all of season 1. All right. Or you can listen to a very popular podcast. It's called The Dollop. It's a very popular history podcast. And they just do a bunch of different American history stuff. So what I did was I picked a grouping, and it focused on slavery, race, and anti-slavery. So this is early American history still. So what it's going to do is basically from colonial America all the way up through John Brown and into the Civil War. So I picked episodes from the Dollop. It's episode 54, 135, 276, 326, 338, 438, 439, and 440. The Dollops tend to be longer than these other history podcast ones, so they're not as many episodes, but time-wise, all of these are going to be very close to the same. The Dollop has some language. One of the guys in there that does the commentary is a comedian, so it can kind of get a little bit saucy sometimes. But you guys are above the 18 age limit, so you're cool. If you don't like curse words, you don't like sometimes crude humor, you may not want the Dollop. Go with one of the more even keel things like American Elections or 1865. But those are 3 really good podcasts that cover early American history. So pick one of them. Do American Elections or 1865 or the Dollop that I've laid out. So the first step for a podcast review, you need to listen to all the episodes. As you're listening to the episodes, you need to take very detailed notes. All right. Focus in, zero in. Pay close attention, just like you would in a lecture or reading a book, is note taking. It's a very big skill that you'll need coming into college. Also, if you do find things that you're going to quote from the podcast, make sure you write down the time. Put the quotation marks around it and write down the time where you found the quote. But like with the review, I really want you to summarize and paraphrase. Quoting is for very specific detail. Quoting is not meant to have, you're not meant to have quotes all over the place in a paper. It's not good writing. So when you do quote, you'll have to cite it. But like I said, mainly paraphrase and summarize. So take detailed notes as you're listening to these episodes. And be sure that you see the theme, the thesis, the topic, that kind of thing in the episodes and in the overbranching story as well. So you can figure out whether or not you think that these podcasters have done a good job presenting this story, presenting this history. So that's what you're doing, right? You're listening, you're taking notes, and you're trying to analyze whether or not you think these people that are doing the podcast did a good job with the evidence, making the story that they're telling you. All right. So the paper, very much like the book review paper. What you're doing is in the first paragraph, your introductory paragraph, you state the podcast intent and its purpose, the thesis, what it's doing. You summarize what it was about, and then you state what you're doing with this, how you are going to go about analyzing these things. Also, like with the book review, I want you guys to tell me about the podcaster or podcasters, and give me a little bit of information about them. Also, the body of it, basically you're doing the same thing that you would do in a book review. You're looking at the evidence and analyzing it, seeing if it is solid evidence that supports their argument, that supports their thesis, that does a good job of telling the story. And then you can give pieces of evidence that you agree with, that you don't agree with, just like you would if it was a book, but you're listening to it instead. So what you're doing is analyzing the evidence. Also, don't forget, remember, these podcasts have web pages, and they will have their sources, the primary materials that they use on their website. All right, so we're in a history book, you'd go to the back of the book and look for the source. For a podcast, you'll go to their website and look for the source of that episode. Also, with the body, like I said, what you're doing is assessing the podcast arguments, see if they're doing a good job of it. And also, while you're doing this, be sure to cover why you think these people created this podcast. And you can do that with the book as well. Why did the author, why did the podcaster, why did they make this work? Why did they make this thing? What was its purpose? Why do you think they did it? All right. And then, of course, you have then the conclusion, where you just wrap things up. And just like with that, you'll give the summary of the podcasts you listen to, all of them, and give your analysis whether they did a good job or not, and then, your opinion. Would you have listened to this on your own? Do you think other people should have listened to this? Where you give your opinion. But just remember, the big thing about all this is analyzation. All right? You're reviewing. You're not reporting. All right? You're digging in and analyzing whether these historians, journalists, podcasters do a good job of using evidence to tell a story. All right? So, that is the gist of it. Of course, these 2 PowerPoints are up under files in Canvas. So as you're getting ready to do this, I'd suggest popping open the PowerPoints, reading over them, so you'll know exactly what to do. Also, as you started, as you pick the podcast or a book, talk to me. I'll help you get started, get going in the right direction. And any questions, of course, you have it all. Just let me know. So, with that, that's it for the day. Have a good afternoon.